And thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation, and also to Renata and Susan from Spinifex who've organised this trip for me and made it so lovely and welcoming. I've never seen women work as hard as those two. I thought I was bad, but really they leave most of us standing. Excuse me. And an acknowledgement to all of the women and men in the room who are the victims and survivors of male violence. And in particular, for this purpose, the sex trade survivors, for speaking out. So today I'm going to speak about some aspects of the research and activism that I've been doing that culminated in the book that Caroline mentioned. And in particular, I'm going to look at the hypocrisy of the left, to which I belong, the political left, whilst not to say that that means that any of us on the left should turn to the right. It just means we should kick those off the left that are hypocrites about violence against women, and in particular, prostitution and pornography. I want to also talk about the racism and colonialism inherent to the sex trade, but we've already had such a great presentation from Sarah, who I also acknowledge as being a major influence on the work that I did for this book, and had the good fortune to meet with the Asian Women Collective back in Montreal in 2016 or 15 maybe even, and learned such a lot from that group and from groups of Indigenous and other women of colour who taught me such a lot about these particular building blocks of the sex trade. And I want to, in the main, look at the disasters of legalisation and decriminalisation. And to say from the offset that there really is very little between the two. So I'm just going to refer to it as legalisation, because as we'll hear from other contributors, decriminalisation is also a licensed form of prostitution, and it's as unregulated as the legalised side. So it's all as bad as each other, except for in New Zealand, it's like the Wild West, because it's even less regulated, as if regulation makes any difference at all to the women and to the levels of abuse. And I'm also going to talk about those little charmers, the men that pay for sex, those gentlemen with their wonderful manners and views towards women, whom I've had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing and speaking to and being with in a room over the past 20 years. So, what inspired me to write my book after activism spanning 40 years that included domestic violence and rape and child sexual abuse campaigns? Well, I was always aware that prostitution was the worst thing that can happen to women and girls. And here I also acknowledge that men and boys are prostituted, but I refer to women and girls because we know that this is violence built on the oppression of women. And so that's why I use that language, but not to dismiss those men and boys who are also abused. But I would be campaigning against these other issues of male violence. And yes, attitudes were terrible. Women were still being murdered. We were still being raped and still being blamed. But it was rare, by the time we really got our teeth into this issue as feminists, that women would be wheeled out speaking up for being battered every Friday night, or that women would speak out for being raped. We were challenging all of those orthodoxies, all of those mythologies. But still, what was happening with the sex trade apologists was that they were constantly not just saying, it's not so bad, or it only happens on a Friday night. They were saying it was good. It was actually something worthwhile. And by the time we got to the 1990s, which is when I started to focus on this issue almost solely, it was liberation for women. We stopped hearing as much about excuses for men although certainly they were still there. The men became invisibilised. It wasn't about the fact that these men saw us as corpses, pieces of meat, whores, thought they could do anything they wanted, buy their way into our bodies. It was that we wanted them to do that. We enjoyed it. So I thought, what the hell? This can't be right. And of course I knew that it was because there was money involved. So I was part of organising a conference in Brighton, a seaside town in the UK. And it was international. We were inviting keynote speakers from the global north and the global south. And it tackled every aspect of male violence. And we had one day on pornography and prostitution. And on that day, this was in 1996, we had to remove the steps leading up to the stage because the pro-prostitution lobbyists that were funded by the European Commission at the time were threatening to storm the stage to speak up for sex workers' rights. So it was clearly a contested issue. And the chair of that session said, "This isn't a debate. We will not debate whether prostitution and the sex trade is harmful to women and girls." Did you notice there was no debate when we talked about female genital mutilation, bride burning, domestic homicide, forced marriage? Did you notice that? So it was then, I think, that in the UK, that issue was galvanised. You were on one side or you were on the wrong side. And it was also the first time that I'd worked directly with a sex trade survivor activist, and her name is Fiona Broadfoot. She's a Brit. She was prostituted from age 15, and she was prostituted for 11 years. And in 1995, she managed to get out of prostitution. The last straw was her cousin, who was also prostituted, being murdered. Now, Fiona made contact with the conference organisers, and we immediately threw her on a panel with Andrea Dworkin, just for a laugh. She'd been doing great work already. She'd been assisting women out of prostitution by just talking on the end of a phone line and going to meet them when they contacted her. Because the support service, in inverted commas, that she had volunteered for was more interested in keeping women in prostitution by giving them condoms and clean needles and referring to their pimps as boyfriends. And Fiona was sick of this, so she decided to set up Street Exit. She got to us, we threw her on the stage with Andrea Dworkin, and the rest is definitely history. Fiona is the founder of the British abolitionist movement, because she was the first one to speak out about her own direct experiences, but not as a victim of terrible things that happen, but as an expert survivor who would tell us all how it really was. Now, at that conference was also a woman called Norma Hoteling, and some of you in this room will have heard of her. She died a few years ago. She was from San Francisco. She'd been street prostituted, homeless, heroin addicted, ended up in prison. This is back in the 1980s. When she came out, she met a good cop who agreed with her that the women shouldn't be arrested, but the Johns should. And she also met a stray dog. And the stray dog helped her with her mental health, and the good cop helped to get the Johns rounded up into the very first curb crawler John school. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't spend a minute with these men convincing them that they shouldn't pay for sex. They'd be in chokey if I had anything to do with it. But I believe in rehabilitation, and I believe in primary prevention. So after that conference, some of us set up our own John School in Yorkshire, in England. And how it worked was this. We asked the police for an unofficial amnesty on arresting the women, which they stuck to in the main, and that they would stop the men, curb crawling as we call it, in their cars trying to pick up women. And we then got them in a room once a month. And Fiona Broadfoot and a woman called Irene Iverson, whose daughter had been murdered by a John, having been groomed and pimped into the sex trade, and the Residents' Association, and a police officer in full uniform, and me, and a couple of others. We all talked to them for the day about why paying for sex was really not a good idea, and what would happen to them if they were caught again. I'd like to say we were successful, but one man wrote to The Guardian anonymously after he'd been there for the day in our school, and he said, "If I'd known that those women were going to be doing this for the day, I would rather have gone to jail." Because he didn't want to be told that what he was doing was harmful. Another man, when I spoke to him face to face at the end of the day, when he'd been told exactly what things were about, said, "So what would happen if I get caught again?" And I said, "Well, you'll go to prison." He said, "Does that mean I've got to take up ballroom dancing again?" Right? This was his hobby. He saw paying for sex as his hobby. But many of the men told me that they were ambivalent about what they were doing, that it didn't particularly give them much pleasure, poor things, that they'd felt that they were peer pressured into it, because it's never their fault, is it? All of them, of course, were in denial. They all knew that the women were only there because of abuse, poverty, being pimped, being trafficked, being raped as children. They knew, but of course they chose to deny this to themselves, or some didn't. Some just didn't care enough to even lie. And this continued through to when I did research with Johns in London as part of the wonderful Dr. Melissa Farley's 6-country research on demand. And I was part of the London research team, where we interviewed 103 Johns. It was an interesting piece of research. Again, we found that the majority of the Johns knew fine well that the women were trafficked, pimped, abused. One said to me, when I asked him from the questionnaire that we were using for all of the men we interviewed, when I said, "How often do you masturbate to pornography?" And let's say this man was aesthetically challenged, right? I mean, most of the men that I've interviewed and seen in brothels and the like who pay for sex, they could get a real date. Yeah. I mean, men really could get a real date. They don't want a real date. So this aesthetically challenged man, when I said, "How often do you masturbate to pornography?" looked at me and he went, "Julie, can I ask you a question?" So my face stayed impassive. And he said, "Is this turning you on?" I said, "No." "How often do you masturbate to?" And he went, very good way of avoiding the question. So I said, in what way is saying emphatically no immediately avoiding the question? He was one of the Johns that answered when we asked him, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think the women enjoy the sexual encounters with you? That he said, "I'm not going to brag, possibly 8. And he was also one of the Johns who said that he didn't believe any of the women were pimped, abused, trafficked, beaten as children, raped as children, homeless. But at the end, he stayed behind and said, "Was I right with all of my answers?" And I said, "You were wrong with all of them." And he hung around needing reassurance so he could go back to the brothel and do it again. And none was coming. Another man, and this was the one that worried me the most, a young, conventionally good-looking man. He'd first paid for sex when he was 15 years old, when his father took him to a brothel in Spain, where it's legal. And I asked him the question, how often do you think the women enjoy sexual encounters with you? And he said, I don't want the women to enjoy it. I'm paying for them. That would be taking it away from me. And he was one of the men that we reported to the police. Because, of course, when you promise anonymity, it only goes so far, does it not? So what gives them the right? What gives men the right to do this? Well, prostitution, as many of you in this room know, is merely a facet of patriarchy, of male power, of male dominance and oppression of women and girls. It's not something separate. If we didn't have male supremacy over women, the sex trade could not survive. It's there as a symptom, as a cause and a consequence of women's oppression. And so we have to deal with it with that in mind. So although if you actually had to take the world population and the figures that we know of men who pay for sex, much higher under legalisation, of course, much, much lower under the Nordic or abolitionist model, where demand is discouraged and criminalised. Pretty average around countries with prohibition, sky high in military towns and areas. But even if you take all of that, the majority of men do not pay for sex. And most people don't like prostitution. What we're talking about is a system. It's a system that needs to be eradicated, and we need to be able to imagine, as Sarah said, eradicating the sex trade before we can even be effective with our fight against global violence towards women and girls. We can't possibly see it any other way. And of course, when people say, how do we eradicate it? And they look puzzled. And you say, well, you've always acknowledged that we should eradicate poverty. You've always said we've got to end racism. You don't hear, well, we should really reduce racism a bit and kind of make it a bit better. Or racist attacks should possibly be a bit less violent. Or it should be regulated so that only between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. can people hurl racist abuse. We say this has to end. This has to stop. And we say we have to stop domestic homicide. And in fact, in pilot projects, in Duluth, for example, in the US, because of multi-agency working and a vision from the entire community, that women did not have to die at the hands of men because of their violence, for a time, domestic homicide rates went down to 0. Of course we can eradicate the sex trade. But here's the stumbling blocks. It's seen as inevitable. Those that want to believe this, or who've listened to the lies from the lobbyists, think that legalisation is the only way. They even argue that that's the way that eventually it will be eradicated, because, the lobbyists say, and their supporters, that would filter out all of the women that don't want to be there. Guess what? That one woman who's going to be left standing, she's going to be very busy. So this is utter nonsense. And the final decision that I took to write my book was realising that everywhere I went, all over the world, when I asked people, including some feminists, including right-minded people who hate abuse of women and girls, when I said, what shall we do to solve the problems inherent to the sex trade, they would say, legalise it, make it safer for the women. And then, of course, after we saw the disaster of legalisation in Holland and in Germany and in Nevada, and when even their politicians admitted that it had failed, they switched to decriminalisation because of New Zealand. A country with more sheep than people. I apologise for anyone in the room. if that's offensive, but let's face it, I'm a Brit and there's plenty I can say about my country. So they would say legalise it. And I would say, why? What would happen if we legalised? And they would come back with the usual mantras. It keeps it above board. Otherwise it will be driven underground. Now, Johns are not the brightest group of men I've ever met. And if they can find the brothels and the street women, we can. There's something called advertising. What else do they say? The women can get health checks. Oh, I didn't realise that women weren't allowed to get health checks unless they were in legal prostitution. And one of the worst sights I've ever seen was in Nevada, in one of Dennis Hoff's brothels. And it really makes me wish I was religious, because then I would believe in evil, and then I would believe in hell, and then I would be sending Dennis Hoff to hell. I saw a list in the reception area where the money is taken from the Johns and towels and condoms are handed out when the women are chosen from a lineup in these hideous rape camps. And there was a list of the women's prostitution names, because we all know women don't want to give their own name, and we all know that part of that is dissociation and not wanting to be there during the transaction. And there was a tick or a cross next to each name and a date. And it was about their blood test, their compulsory blood test, the test that checks them against HIV infection, so that the Johns know that they're raping a clean, disease-free woman. Now, in what way does this reassure anyone in this room or out there that these Johns use condoms? So you know this health promise that we get with legalisation? It's bullshit. The women are forcibly tested, and in my country, Josephine Butler, well over 100 years ago, campaigned for the end of women being treated like diseased vessels and held in lock hospitals until they tested clean for syphilis, etc., so that they didn't pass that on to the men who were coming to pay to rape them. So what else do these supporters of legalisation say? They say there'll be no violence. Oh. So somehow they argue that not just decriminalising the women, the prostituted people, which we are all, I hope, in support of in this room, but in order to stop the Johns and the pimps abusing the women, and this is even if we don't believe, as I do, that every act of prostitution is abuse and violence, but imagine that we don't think that, and that we think there's something called additional violence during the prostitution transaction. These will just disappear if we don't criminalise, if we decriminalise the pimps, the Johns, the brothel owners, the traffickers. How does that work? So when you ask people, but how is it that, oh, because you see, when the police can arrest the women, that's where they're abused. So I say, okay, so let's introduce the Nordic model so that the women aren't arrested, so that the police not only don't arrest them, rape and beat them up legitimately, right? But they also are there when the woman wants to ring up if a John is just rude to her or doesn't use a condom. Okay, they say. So what else? Tell me why else legalisation will solve this problem. Well, they say, you can never get rid of prostitution, and it aggravates men if they're being criminalised. It makes them dangerous Johns. So that means that the men won't be aggravated and they won't be dangerous anymore. So once you've knocked that down, and once you've gone through every single mythology about legalisation, people get it. It's only the lobbyists that carry on with their nonsense. People get it because the language of the lobby is designed to mislead them, to make them think that decriminalisation, which is the term they use now, just means stopping arresting the women. Who's going to be against that? The language, as Sarah said, of sex work is also designed to glamorise and to sanitise the Prostitution Act and system. When I was reporting for the Guardian newspaper in 2006 on a series of murders of 5 street prostituted women in Ipswich in England, there were people doing comment, op-eds, there were those doing features, as I was, there were those doing news. And it was a really big and shocking case. So we all received an email we have a style guide at The Guardian. It means whether you use a capital letter for royal family or, however you spell, I don't know, whatever, and which expletives you're allowed to use in which circumstances. And the email said, what terminology shall we use when reporting on prostitution-related issues? Remember, these were 5 murdered women. Some of the tabloids, by the way, had called them hookers. So the Guardian thought it was doing the right thing. And it says, is it sex worker? Is it prostitute? Is it this? Is it that? And of course, everybody just replied and said, sex worker. And I replied and just said, how about women? That might be an idea. And I didn't get a reply. And I can't tell you how many times my headlines are changed to say sex worker or prostitute, terms that I won't use. So these progressives, these people that you argue with about why legalisation and decriminalisation just will not be effective, I get why the men on the left, not all, but many, don't give a hoot about violence against women, because they may have progressive politics as socialists, but they still use their male power, they still consume pornography, hit their female partners, commit acts of rape that they don't think is rape. But you would think they would care about the racism and colonialism inherent to the sex trade, wouldn't you? These white dudes, these liberal, progressive dudes. Because this is all part of their global politics. And in my country, we have an opposition party, the Labour Party, full of absolute idiots. The leader, if he had any fewer brain cells, you'd have to water him twice a day. So he comes out with the usual nonsense. The niqab, is a choice, liberating for women. The sex trade should be decriminalised. How do we stop assaults on trains, women-only carriages? I mean, seriously. And he's a lost cause. But the one thing that he does spout about is, of course, we are all anti-racists. And we're all against colonialism. I mean, he goes so far as to support some regimes in the Middle East that are dangerous, seriously dangerous to world peace, because he's a cultural relativist and believes that we should be paying forever for Western foreign policy, even if we're talking about supporting the Syrian regime. He's that crazy. But when it comes to prostitution, the fact that, as we've heard from Sarah, it couldn't exist without the building bricks of colonialism, imperialism and racism, all bets seem to be off. And I've met a number of sex trade survivors who are of colour and indigenous who have said this is about how no one cares if this happens to us. We are seen as the women that prostitution can happen to, so it doesn't have to happen to other women. And white women are also responsible for this attitude. And so white women cannot escape responsibility. So when we talk about racism, And we say you really shouldn't support the sex trade, leftist man, because you're against racism. They bring out the agency routine. Because all of a sudden they give a damn about women of colour having agency. All of a sudden they are the best friend to black women and indigenous women. They're saying, but you're racist because you're telling a black woman what she can and can't do with her body. Hence the phrase white feminism, capital W, capital F, that was coined and is thrown at women of colour who are abolitionists. All bets are off. I've heard a white woman and a white man scream at a black woman who spent all her adult life fighting FGM and who's an abolitionist, "Fuck off, you white feminist." There was a headline in the lovely Vice magazine. Don't know if anyone reads it. So cool. By a trans activist called Paris Lees, who's just a misogynist, who's white, whose title of her beautiful article that should be up for a Pulitzer, "Fuck off, white feminism." That was its heading. I should worry about mine. And it was all about how you were transphobic if you were a feminist abolitionist against the sex trade, because trans women need to sell sex in order to pay for hormones and surgery. We also hear that we are disablist if we are abolitionists. See how we're the ones causing every oppression in the world because we want to dismantle the global sex trade. We literally would pull paraplegic men who have been war veterans out of their wheelchairs and kick them to the ground. This is what we spend our time doing because we don't think that it's a good enough excuse for them to pay for sex. Because we don't think any man has the right to pay for sex. And we think that the disabled men can get a real date also, right? Because actually, if you think about it, there are plenty of people who can't get a real date because they're assholes. What do we say? Let's open a brothel just for assholes. Well, guess what? We already have. So, briefly, onto my final point. And it ties in with the fuck off white feminist routine. And it's about fake unions, particularly in the global south, that are funded by George Soros, the Open Society Foundation. And I have to say, as a person of Jewish heritage, I take great exception that whenever any progressive criticises the Open Society Foundation, and Soros in particular, because he's a monster, we are labelled and branded anti-Semitic. It's an absolute disgrace that this is thrown at us by people, again, who don't give a damn about anti-Semitism in their daily life. So the Open Society Foundation, that used to focus on education in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe and rebuilding societies, and it was a pretty good thing, now seems to focus on the fight for decriminalising the entire sex trade across the global south. And how better to do it than to say, look at these empowered Cambodian women. They're all sex workers' rights activists. You white feminists, you are imperialists. How dare you be abolitionists? In and of itself, abolitionism is racist. Now, I was in Cambodia, and I had the privilege of interviewing a group of women who were street prostituted, and they were actually, I've never seen women in such a bad state and still be standing. All of them. Some were HIV positive, some had had babies with Johns from rape. All were extremely ill. And they were brought along to meet with me, and I had my interpreter, and they came along with a Cambodian woman on a very high salary who was speaking for them. She kept cutting over them and speaking for them. They were desperate to tell me their stories, and they were desperate to get out of the sex trade. They would need $200 each. That's what they would need, but they weren't going to be given it. What they were given instead by joining this union that they didn't even know was a union, because it was not a union, was that if they died, they'd pay for their funerals, this Cambodian women's group. That if they were arrested, they'd come and get them from the prison and take them home, like pimps do, etc., etc. But the paid staff from this Women's Unity project would go and speak regionally in Thailand and all over in Vietnam as part of this global network of sex work projects, heavily funded. And they'd say, we have 60,000 Cambodian sex workers' rights on our books. The Thai equivalent would do the same. The Vietnamese would do the same. The East African groups would do the same. None of these women knew that they were sex workers' rights campaigners. None of them wanted the Johns to be decriminalised. All of them wanted to get out. If that's not colonialism, I don't know what is. But that's what we're up against. I'm going to finish just by saying that it's wholly possible to dismantle the sex trade. We have to be that little bit braver, even than we already are, and I include myself in this. We need to be able to say to people when they stand up and say, speaking as a sex worker, tell me exactly what you mean by that, because I don't believe you, because I think that you are a profiteer, and we don't accept you speaking for other women. And even if, like me, you haven't been in prostitution, we as women have to speak from experience, because there is a mile apart in many ways in terms of experience between those of us that have been prostituted and those that have not. But we know we exist under the same system, and there for the grace of God go I. So we have to be able to say, we are one. We are one. We do not divide, and we do not divide and rule. And if we can't speak up against this sex trade, against the horrors that's happening to millions of women right now, then we're not going to get very far with all the other issues that we've got to face. But this is the hardest battle, which is why we've got to be together.